Putin's latest plan to turn the tide in Ukraine, calling on North Korean troops? Yep, after running out of his own seasoned fighters, he's enlisting soldiers from North Korea, where military experience often involves shoveling fields. The plan is to disguise them as Russian soldiers and hope no one notices. But here's the kicker. Some North Korean soldiers are reportedly defecting to Ukraine before they even fire a shot for Russia. Could this desperate alliance be Putin's final misstep, one that ends up arming his enemy instead? And why is North Korea risking its own resources for Putin in the first place? The answer lies in a closer look at how Pyongyang benefits from a weakened Russia. According to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, NATO countries have provided close to $240 billion in aid from the start of the war in February 2022 to the end of August 2024. The $240 billion is split between direct economic aid and donations in weapons, ammunition, equipment, or training the Ukrainian troops. In fact, the amount spent on Ukraine by NATO closely approximates the combined Russian military budget for the past 3 years. And the results from those donations have been nothing but impressive. During the first half of 2024, Russia has failed to make significant progress in Ukraine on practically every front. The summer invasion of Kharkiv was an utter failure, resulting in Russia losing as many as 70,000 troops in under 2 months. The supposedly modern T-14 Armata tanks have proven to be no match for drone warfare and long-range tactics that both countries have developed and used extensively throughout the conflict. But perhaps the biggest event in the war happened at the beginning of August, when Ukraine decided to go on the offensive for the first time. Initially, with only a few hundred soldiers, the Ukrainian military crossed the border into the Russian Kursk region and started occupying territory. Although the Kremlin quickly insisted the invaders will be dealt with swiftly, the reality was the exact opposite. Russia essentially was completely unprepared for Ukraine managing to get beyond its borders. While Putin threatened a nuclear response if Ukraine fired NATO weapons at Russian territory, one of his security red lines, Ukraine managed to get into Kursk without firing any of the donated weapons. When Russia failed to mount a timely response, the message was clear: Putin was bluffing all along. This created significant issues for Russia. Throughout their war effort, most of Russia's military focus was getting as many contract soldiers outfitted and ready for frontline combat. This meant that the other available soldiers Russia could use, conscripts, were left high and dry. According to interviews with some of the prisoners of war captured in Kursk, the Russian military gave them only a few weeks of basic combat training before shipping them to their posts in the border region. But why didn't Russia want to use their conscripts? After all, the country's mandatory service system has brought in roughly 130,000 conscripts per year on a rotating 6-month system. The answer lies in Russian law. You see, after the catastrophic war the Soviet Union had with Afghanistan in the 1980s, the death toll of the 10-year conflict soared to millions, including a large number of conscripts. Internal pressure caused the Soviet Union to declare that conscripts would no longer be deployed abroad. The Russian Federation kept the law when it inherited the Union. This means that no matter how many conscripts the Russian military has, their role is purely defensive. And because of that, they've not been trained and equipped nearly as much as enlisted soldiers. This fact led to Russia mounting a counteroffensive on Kursk about a month after the initial Ukrainian invasion. Far too little and too late. Even worse, with Russia needing to use its undertrained conscripts and divest some of its resources from the front line, it hasn't managed to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. By mid-October, reports from the Russian armed forces suggest that only half of the occupied territory has been recaptured. This glacial progress meant that between 120,000 and 200,000 Russians remain forcibly displaced from the Kursk region, potentially escalating problems for the Russian government. The dire situation in Kursk sent Putin searching for answers. One possible solution was to try to leverage other countries to help them more directly, which is precisely where North Koreans come in. North Korea is one of the few countries that has been a long-term ally of both Russia and China, which are in an alliance themselves. Throughout the Russian war effort, North Korea has surged in importance, and for a few good reasons. You see, North Korea has been practically raised from the ground up by Chinese and Russian donations, military aid, and economic aid. Most of the country's military equipment has its roots in Soviet weapons, which it has either used as is or modified. Additionally, the country has relatively advanced ballistic missile and artillery munition production systems, owing to the fact that long-range warfare is practically the only way for it to stay a relevant threat to its southern neighbor. North Korea has attempted more than 30 missile launches in 2023 and a record 64 tests in 2022. Roughly half of those launches were complete failures. The missiles presumably lack any meaningful firepower and defensive capabilities, so there's not quite a reason to worry just yet. But it has still made the country one of the most prolific ballistic missile testers. In fact, North Korea's ability to manufacture weapons and ammunition compatible with Russian platforms is a possible worry. While Russia has proved that its military is not quite at the technological level it needs to be to seriously threaten NATO, one of its best assets is its artillery technology. The most modern self-propelled artillery platforms like the two S-19 will blow their Western counterparts out of the water in pretty much every respect. For one, Russian weapons typically have a much better sustained fire rate, with the newest designs aiming for roughly 10 rounds per minute. For reference, Western weapons typically achieve around 4 to 6 rounds per minute. Second, Russia has been stockpiling its artillery for years, and it's one of their few weapon types that hasn't gone obsolete nearly as fast as others. Considering that some estimates suggest that Russia lost up to 20,000 artillery pieces over the war, but still has plenty of them left, it's easy to see why large numbers might be working for the strategy. When you have enough artillery lined up, you don't have to be terribly precise or have top-notch armor-piercing rounds. A steady barrage of raining onto the battlefield will render Ukrainian troops unable to mount a serious counteroffensive. This tactic is precisely one of the major reasons why Russia has been able to maintain control over the occupied territory in Donbass and slowly push inward, even at a glacial pace. The Ukrainian military might have more advanced weapons, and its ingenious use of kamikaze drones might be able to take out artillery, but the numbers are working in Russia's favor, at least for now. But despite both sides getting the same drones from China, the country is also lending its anti-drone technology to Russia. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drones have a terrible success rate, with roughly only 1 in 10 drones making it to its target, and that leaves Russia's artillery free to wreak havoc across the battlefield. This brings us back to North Korea, which has ramped up its production capacities to manufacture artillery rounds that Russian weapons can use. A South Korean report from February 2024 suggested that North Korea may have sent Russia as many as 9,152mm artillery shells in the previous 6 months. And there's no reason to believe that trade has stopped, or that there aren't shipments to Russia that were unaccounted for previously. Simply put, North Korea has allowed Russia to stay relevant in the war by enhancing one of its few advantages. But what does North Korea get out of the deal? While the agreements between Russia, China, and North Korea are not publicized, it's safe to say that the most likely scenario is Russia sending food supplies and other vital items to North Korea in return. If that wasn't enough, North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense pact in June this year, vowing to defend each other's borders. At the time, this was only a blip on the radar of world news, considering that neither country was actually territorially threatened. But then, the aforementioned invasion of Kursk happened. Ostensibly, Putin is now leveraging that as an opportunity to bring North Korea even deeper into the war. To that end, a South Korean report from October 15 suggested that 3,000 troops were spotted being moved from North Korea to Russia, presumably to be deployed somewhere in its territory. A subsequent report by Ukrainian intelligence has increased the number of troops to 10,000. Additional reports have suggested that the first batch of North Korean troops would contain up to 12,000. And where are all these people going to be deployed? Yes, you guessed it, Kursk. With Putin insisting the invasion means that Russian territory is threatened, rather than invoking one of his red lines that he says justifies the use of nuclear weapons, employing North Korea seems to be a middle ground solution. An infusion of 50,000 or more soldiers in Kursk would allow the Russian military to get a reprieve from combat in that region. Essentially, Russia plans to use North Korean troops for its defensive measures in border regions. This plan has a few major flaws, but let's first discuss the actual state of the troops that North Korea is sending to Russia. One of the ways that North Korea has been able to project any kind of military threat to South Korea in the past decades was due to the country's frankly overzealous mandatory military service requirements. North Korean men are required to serve in the nation's military for up to 8 years, while women serve for 5 years. These requirements are somewhat of an improvement from a few years ago when men had to be in the country's military for a full decade. The mandatory conscription means that North Korea keeps a standing army of around 1.3 million soldiers, which is practically on par with the US Armed Forces in terms of manpower. Additionally, some reports suggest that North Korea can conscript roughly 8 million people into the army on short notice in the event of a large-scale conflict. These numbers indicate that the 10,000 to 12,000 troops that North Korea has sent to Russia so far are practically a drop in the bucket compared to what it could send. This means that Russia might receive more and more soldiers as time goes on. But as mentioned, there are a few issues with this. First, while North Korea keeps a large standing army, its military is based on Soviet-era practices, and it's assumed that most of its equipment is decades behind modern Western or even Russian militaries. While North Korea and South Korea are technically still involved in the Korean War, actual fighting stopped in 1953 when the armistice of the North Korean War was signed. After that, North Korea became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, keeping its relations confined to its closest allies like China and Russia. Therefore, the country's military doesn't have any real-life combat experience, and the only people in the country who did died a long time ago. This means that even if the soldiers North Korea sends to Russia are the cream of the crop of its country's military, that bar is so low that the soldiers are unlikely to fare much better than Russian conscripts anyway. North Korean defectors in South Korea have claimed that the average soldier suffers from food shortages, malnutrition, and possibly a lack of modern combat training. Secondly, the soldiers that North Korea has sent are unlikely to speak any Russian, which is primarily used in the Russian military. This creates a potentially insurmountable communication barrier between them and the native Russian forces. The reports of North Korean movements suggest that around 500 officers and 3 generals have joined the troops. Additionally, Ukrainian intelligence intercepting Russian communications suggests that there should be 1 interpreter and 3 officers per 30 soldiers that North Korea is sending. They are the ones likely to be serving the role of middlemen between the two countries' respective ground forces. But, as you might have noticed, the number of troops on the move and the number of reported officers don't match the intelligence, and there's no mention of civilian or even military interpreters in any of the reports from South Korea or Ukraine about troop movements. That means that the Russian military might still be expecting more troops to come from North Korea, or that it needs to pull some of its own men from other units to act as senior officers or interpreters for the new forces. Either way, the lack of communication between Russian and North Korean soldiers on the ground means that they are unlikely to be as effective as they should be in the first place. Finally, North Korea doesn't typically allow its people to leave the country without an incentive to keep them chained to the motherland. For diplomats, this usually means that one member of the family will be left in North Korea as an unofficial hostage. For the soldiers who are traveling to Russia, the preventative measures are likely to be even harsher. A report from the Center for International and Strategic Studies suggests that the soldiers are likely to be cherry-picked to be the most loyal to the country or have significant ties that would make misconduct, that is, desertion, potentially devastating. The report indicates that the troops could be accompanied by officials from the Workers' Party of Korea, the ruling body of the North Korean government. The officials would have the authority to follow the troops' every move, documenting their appearance, behavior, combat preparedness, and even more importantly, whether they plan to take items or knowledge back home. The last item on the list is one that's been particularly important for North Korea. Keeping outside knowledge away from the citizens is just one of the ways that the country has maintained a stranglehold on the population, and new interactions between North Koreans and Russians might have exactly the opposite effect. To counter that, the Center for International and Strategic Studies suggests that the soldiers might be sent to re-indoctrination camps to reaffirm their loyalty to the country before they return to North Korea. But what about the men themselves? How likely is it that they're actually willing to go to Russia to fight for another army? There are a few different avenues to answering these questions. As mentioned, there's a high possibility that the soldiers sent to Russia are going to be among the most loyal and capable, making them relatively safe bets to stick around in the army, and then return back home, if they don't die in the process, which is more likely. For these troops, going to Russia presents a unique opportunity to get out of North Korea to gain prestige and higher social standing, including better job opportunities back home. Even the families of people who died in the war in Russia might get significant benefits, social respect, and advantages. Additionally, working outside of the country will give these people an opportunity to earn significantly more than they could at home. Based on interviews with previous defectors, the average soldier earns less than $1 per day. Yep, that's right, a single dollar. The deal with Russia, where the country will pay a regular Russian soldier's salary to North Korea, stipulates that only 10 to 15% of that will be given to the soldier. Even then, a year on the battlefield will net a soldier somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500, which is practically a fortune in North Korea. This could result in many more young men volunteering to serve in Russia, despite more than likely being constantly under surveillance by North Korean authorities. The chance to experience another country and earn significantly more money than back home is practically a siren's call. Of course, there's also the matter of the inherent danger that comes with serving alongside the Russian military. Initial reports from the Ukrainian military have suggested that some North Koreans are already seeing combat operations in Kursk, and even possibly outside the region. The combination of foreign terrain, language barriers, and subpar experience and training seems to be affecting the new North Korean soldiers, as the Ukrainians say they were less than impressed after seeing their performance. Reports state that Russia has put the North Korean men in Russian uniforms to make them less discernible from native Russians. Engagements with these soldiers have been on a small scale so far in Kursk, with military intelligence suggesting that this is a way to test the Ukrainian defenses set up in the region and the actual combat potential of the new troops. While the casualties among North Korean soldiers are yet to be precisely calculated, reports from the Ukrainian military confirm that several North Korean men have already died while fighting for Russia, and more are likely to die if the alliance between Russia and North Korea continues. This brings about the second type of soldier that might have come from Korea, the planned defector. According to reports from Sospilna, a Ukrainian broadcasting company, at least 18 North Korean men have deserted their posts in Kursk. This might be a direct result of the soldiers being faced with the harsh reality of fighting in a modern war. Of course, it could be a completely unrelated event, where the soldiers use the redeployment itself as an opportunity to defect from the country. Previously, most defections from North Korea were done over the China and Russia borders, as the DMZ between North and South Korea is practically impossible to cross. However, both China and Russia have laws in place that call for the return of any captured defectors to North Korea. Still, defectors take their chances by crossing over the northern border of North Korea. From there, they enter countries like Mongolia, to the north of China, or Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, to the south of China. But the ultimate finish line for North Korean defectors is much closer to home, South Korea. This is exactly why they try to get into the territory of some of the aforementioned Chinese neighbors. Unlike China, these countries are friendlier to North Korean defectors. Rather than deporting them back to North Korea, they are moved to South Korea instead. This is how most of the former soldiers who have asked to join Ukraine's military actually defected from North Korea, and likely the most common way to do so. However, the war in Ukraine presented a somewhat unique opportunity. As we stated, the troops that North Korea has sent to Russia are likely to be extremely loyal to the country. Add to that the fact that the North Korean officials could be following their every move, or even holding their families hostage to prevent escape attempts. And it's uncertain just how many soldiers would consider attempting to defect from Kursk. If they do, there's really no precedent for North Koreans crossing the Russian border over into any of its neighboring countries. Given how Russia's neighbors to the west are either NATO members, Belarus or Ukraine, and that the Kursk region is only close to the Ukrainian border, it would likely be up to the Ukrainian authorities to determine what to do with any successful defectors. There's also the matter of Ukraine still holding a sizable chunk of occupied territory in the Kursk region. Even if Russia has received more trained soldiers in the form of North Koreans replacing Russian conscripts, there's ambiguity over whether this will greatly help Russia mount a successful counteroffensive in the border region. According to a BBC report from November 11th, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry estimates that Russia has deployed roughly 50,000 troops to the Kursk region to try and retake control of it. Out of these troops, at least 10,000 could be the aforementioned North Koreans. The actual count of North Korean soldiers being actively deployed in Kursk is uncertain. As we mentioned earlier, Ukraine has frequently reported that Russia is outfitting these North Koreans in Russian military garb, making them virtually indistinguishable from Russian soldiers from afar. Regardless, having thousands of North Korean soldiers engaging in battle with Ukrainian troops is likely going to end in Ukraine's favor. This is due to the Ukrainian military already having more than a few years of actual combat experience and creating detailed modes of modern warfare, including drone operations, which North Korea is unlikely to be prepared for. The clashes could result in squads of North Korean soldiers getting wiped out daily. Based on the numbers posted by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, Russia is estimated to be losing more than 1,200 soldiers every day. Even if only a fraction of these losses are in the Kursk region, North Korean troop numbers could dwindle to practically nothing over the next few months. In a worst-case scenario, they could be gone within a few weeks. And this is where older North Korean defectors going to Ukraine plan to make a difference. By aligning themselves with the Ukrainian military as volunteers, they could potentially join either the troops stationed at Kursk or the ones on the front lines in the Donbas region. While most of the 200 ex-military men are unlikely to be fit for service anymore, they could use their experience of serving in the North Korean army in other ways. A North Korean spokesperson from the group mentioned that their mere presence in Ukraine would be a psychological weapon that could be used against fellow North Koreans in Russia. They could be examples of the benefits North Korean soldiers who dare defect and cross over to the Ukrainian side could see. The volunteers could act as interpreters and broadcast messages that specifically target the North Korean members of the Russian military. This would create a double loss for Russia in a way. If the North Korean defectors working for Ukraine managed to persuade their compatriots stationed in Kursk to leave the Russian military altogether, it could put a dent in Russia's plans to retake the region with foreign forces. But more importantly, it would show Russians that North Korean soldiers might not be as reliable to them as it would first seem. This could potentially damage the relationship between Russia and North Korea, which might have devastating consequences for both nations. The planned mutual defense agreement between the countries hinges on the fact that North Korea can provide something of value to Russia. Before the North Korean troops were deployed to Kursk, this value came in the form of regular artillery ammunition shipments. In response, Russia is suspected to have sent vital food supplies to North Korea. For the soldiers themselves, Russia is likely paying much more, considering that there are reports that it's paying North Korea over $200 million a year for the 10,000 soldiers, and sending up to 700,000 metric tons of rice. If those soldiers ended up not fighting for Russia at all, then Russia would have effectively wasted the money and effort of conscripting and transporting them from North Korea to Kursk. Even worse for Putin, North Korean soldiers defecting directly to Ukraine might make them eligible to serve in the Ukrainian International Legion, although it's unlikely, effectively giving the Ukrainian military more manpower, all on Russia's dime. The monetary loss that Russia would need to swallow could sour the agreement between the two countries. If a precedent is set showing that North Korean troops aren't reliable and loyal to Russia, then Russia doesn't have any guarantees that the next batch of soldiers won't behave the same. As a result, its investments in North Korea might find themselves being rerouted elsewhere. This is warranted by Russia's economy practically working overtime to fund the war. As the country has lost trade connections with most of the world after the invasion, its other major partners are in Central Asia and the Middle East, with the latter having their own problems in the current Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah conflict. But the more important aspect of North Koreans defecting from Russia would be the devastating reputation loss that both countries would suffer. North Korea has been making waves in global geopolitics, particularly due to its rising ballistic missile technology level and extreme militarization capacity. But the country has been practically shielded by alliances with Russia and China. If the Kremlin sees that its investment in North Korea is not bearing much fruit, even though North Korea is fulfilling its end of the mutual defense agreement, then one part of that alliance might be over. The situation with China isn't much better. China has been a relatively silent ally of Russia for the past 30 months or so. It's helped Russia mitigate Western sanctions, and most likely smuggled vital technology into Russia so it could continue to manufacture modern weapons systems. However, on the public scene, China hasn't officially condemned nor provided support for Russia's plans. The one time China made a definitive show of support to Russia was proposing a bold peace or ceasefire agreement in which Russia would get to keep the territory it occupied in Donbas, something that Ukraine would likely never settle for. China knows that its alliance with Russia is on thin ice. With over 30 months of warfare, Russia is slowly losing the ability to funnel its natural resources into China, a trade deal on which the entire China-Russian relations actually hinge, rather than some geopolitical camaraderie. And if the war in Russia continues to rage, countries that have been cooperative with China might start looking toward NATO or its allies. This could lead to China losing valuable trade agreements in the long run. The presence of North Korean troops in Russia further complicates matters. As long as these troops stay in Kursk, Putin is technically justified in calling for a mutual defense agreement between Russia and North Korea. However, if the Russian military makes a misstep and deploys North Korean soldiers on the front lines in Donbass, it would translate to nothing short of North Korea also declaring an aggressive war on Ukraine. This could possibly set NATO on a path to do the same, directly sending its own military to Ukraine in response or ramping up its military equipment donations to the country. If Russia doesn't play this carefully, it could inadvertently drag both North Korea and China into war, not only with Ukraine but with NATO and its various allies. China most likely isn't ready for this, especially with Russia already weakened by fighting a prolonged war. As a result, China itself could also be rethinking its alliance with North Korea. If North Korea does end up losing support from both Russia and China as a result of directly taking part in the war in Ukraine, there's no telling what might happen. As mentioned, North Korea and South Korea are still technically embroiled in the Korean War. While South Korea hasn't made any offensive moves yet, and its military has been purely defense-orientated so far, shows of blatant aggression by North Korea are unlikely to go unnoticed, and North Korea sending over 10,000 soldiers to a country halfway across the world can be seen as nothing but aggressive. The North Korean military has also recently bombed two major roads that used to connect the northern and southern parts of the Korean peninsula, further trying to separate itself from South Korea by declaring it a hostile state. The South Korean military is considered to be decades ahead of its North Korean counterpart, at least in terms of conventional warfare. The military is frequently ranked among the top 10 most powerful in the world. This high ranking is partially due to ongoing alliances with the US, which has allowed the country to modernize its domestic defense industry in recent decades. Thus, South Korea has become the world's 9th largest weapons exporter. The bulk of the country's military development efforts are put into creating an insurmountable defensive force, spurred by the fact that Pyongyang and Seoul are just 120 miles away from one another. South Korea's military has fewer active personnel, but probably more reservists, since it has a similar mandatory military service requirement to North Korea, albeit with shorter service durations. This means a potential renewal of the Korean War would see the South Korean military outnumbered, but still maintain a clear technological advantage in conventional warfare. Of course, there are worries that North Korea has been developing nuclear weapons, especially considering its proclivity to conduct missile tests by the dozens each year. South Korea currently doesn't have nuclear weapons on its own, relying on the US nuclear deterrence systems for protection. However, the recent shifts in the US foreign policy, which are likely going to move away from South Korea with President-elect Donald Trump being reinstalled in January, could mean that South Korea might start planning to develop its own nuclear weapons. This would mean that China would see yet another nuclear country in its vicinity, further discouraging it from supporting North Korea openly. All these factors combined make North Koreans being stationed in Russia a dangerous prospect. First, the soldiers could very well be killed without making a significant impact in either Kursk or the regions closer to the front in Donbass. Essentially, they'd be sent to their deaths for no good reason. Secondly, the alliance between Russia and North Korea might become strained if the latter's military proves to be of little use to Russia. This could lead to dangerous precedents, where South Korea becomes emboldened in the use of its military or further ramps up its defensive arsenals in anticipation of a renewed conflict on the peninsula. Third, China's situation grows more precarious with every one of its allies making waves in global geopolitics, but the country itself is not yet powerful enough to exert influence and military power that could rival the US. And fourth, North Korea sending troops to Russia could mean NATO can justify being more aggressive in assisting Ukraine, which could cut short Russia's attempts to gain more ground in Donbass rather quickly. Throughout all that, it's essentially up to Ukraine whether it accepts the North Korean defector volunteers from South Korea. If those new additions can make a difference in Kursk by directly making North Korean soldiers defect from Russia, it could lead to a series of events that inevitably turn the war in Ukraine's favor and damage Russia and China's reputation in global geopolitics. And they could also make a real difference by potentially saving thousands of lives. What do you think? How will the relationship between North Korea, Russia, and Ukraine progress in light of these events? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching.